key conservation protected areas and conservation landscapes, which happen to be, most of them happen to be around the boundaries of countries. So this program, which started in 2006, actually started with a pilot program where we worked on declared, at least demarcated these conservation landscapes, which connect protected areas, but look at much more than just the protected areas. And the lines that you see here, the red, green, and blue lines, are the economic corridors that have been developed in the region. And here, the issue we're facing is that these economic corridors are creating increased pressure on the conservation landscapes, and therefore the question of how to reconcile between development caused by increased economic activity in these economic corridors with the need to protect the conservation landscapes, which are important for biodiversity as well as for ecosystem services. Interestingly, when the program was first started, these conservation landscapes were demarcated mostly on the basis of biodiversity hotspots. So it looked at key biodiversity areas identified by NGOs, WWF, or the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, for instance, and it sort of covers most of the areas that, as much as possible, which include all those key biodiversity hotspots. But what was not done so much during that initial phase was to look at other ecosystem service values that are required also to sustain the economies of the region. So therefore, moving forward, this program is now just being extended for the second phase. A strong emphasis that is being placed now is on looking at these same ecosystems or conservation landscapes, but from a much more holistic perspective, particularly in terms of ecosystem services and how these landscapes need to be prioritized in terms of not just promoting protected areas and biodiversity, but also enhancing ecosystem services. And the reason that we adopted a regional approach to this problem, or at least addressing this conservation of these landscapes, is that most of these ecosystems, as I mentioned, they transcend administrative boundaries. So many of them require decision making that cuts across countries. And we've made some progress in the first phase between two countries, for instance, Cao Bang province in Vietnam and Guangxi province in China, which now collaborate on managing species, human species, or between Yunnan province and province of Laos, which are managing elephant migrations. However, this type of cross-border collaboration needs to move much beyond simply managing a specific species or a particular landscape. Most of the threats to these ecosystems actually originate from outside the region, outside the country's borders. Much of the pressure on these landscapes comes from land concessions, countries being pressured to change land uses for large-scale agricultural plantations or commercial timber plantations, or for mining concessions. Many of these are required because of the demand from its neighboring countries. So just looking at, for instance, Myanmar and the timber production or the export of timber from Myanmar, what this graph shows is that the majority of the timber is actually exported out of Myanmar to China, and India, and to Thailand. Similarly, if you look at timber extraction and export from Laos, much of it goes either to Thailand, to Vietnam, some to Japan, some to the EU. The majority is actually meeting a demand from just within the sub-region. So therefore, trying to address And the same goes for other issues like trade in wildlife species, or even if you look at hydropower development, the Lao, which considered the battery of this region, has the potential to generate a lot of hydropower, but it's primarily to meet growing demand in Vietnam and Thailand. So therefore, in order to address these sorts of issues, you do need a regional approach. You need to look at both addressing problems at the source, but also problems from where they are created, or at least address where the demand is coming from. Another reason that we've also adopted a regional approach is that in order to look at opportunities to manage ecosystem services or ecosystems also still requires regional approaches. One pilot, for instance, is to look at, this is an example of one pilot study that is being done now to look at one particular economic corridor, which is the North-South economic corridor, and trying to reduce its carbon footprint. These corridors have become more accessible now and are used much more now because of the expansion of roads, networks, and so on. And the carbon footprint from this particular economic corridor is increased rapidly because of increased freight movement across between China and Thailand. Now, this particular study was done to look at how to offset some of the carbon footprint from increased freight movement or vehicle movement by offsetting in certain protected area systems that are being promoted under the same program in these economic, in these conservation landscapes. So, for instance, according to the calculations we made, 12% of the carbon emissions from the corridor could be offset by investing in afforestation or reforestation activities in some of the conservation landscapes that have been identified in Yunnan province. So these sorts of interventions all require a regional response. But if you look at the challenges that we face with addressing ecosystem management, service management from a regional perspective, these are some of the challenges we face. Many of the countries are at different levels of capacity, degrees of capacity to address these issues varies between countries. So countries which are poorer or less developed, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, for instance, tend to lose from the pressure imposed on them from its neighboring countries. We also lack the institutional or legal regimes for doing transboundary management. That's one issue that this program has been able to address through these sub-regional forums, is to create regional platforms for engaging countries, all countries, as well as working across the sectors in trying to bring ecosystem service values or ecosystem service, the importance of ecosystem services into the decision making. Program has done a few activities such as improving, taking strategic environmental assessments, or using spatial tools, multi-criteria analysis to inform sector development plans or sectoral land use plans, provincial plans, and so on. However, to this date, we not used ecosystem service values in these tools. So that's where we feel that there's a clear gap and why we need to try and introduce ecosystem service valuation into the decision-making frameworks. And that gets to the next point, which is that the reason that the program's not been able to use ecosystem service values or assessments is really not being able to develop a framework in which these values, there are lots of different studies that have been done on biodiversity value, biodiversity a particular landscape or the value of marine fish or freshwater fish and so on, but there's not been a framework in which these values could actually be incorporated in a decision-making process, and being able to incorporate these values and information about ecosystem service stocks, flows and values to inform the type of investments that go into these landscapes. So that's where the program is really looking to experience from other countries, other regions, to be able to adopt frameworks where ecosystem values and information can actually be integrated into planning decision making. Finally, there's also a need to look at one of the challenges has been that similarly we don't have the mechanisms for financial and other incentives to be promoted. For instance, if you probably heard a lot of controversy over the development of dams in Laos, hydropower projects in Laos. But if you were trying to discourage Laos from developing its hydropower protection, there's got to be some way to compensate Laos for the losses it's going to make from not taking up those projects. So other countries that stand to lose from the development of hydropower in Laos needs to be able to compensate Laos for that loss. But there are no mechanisms doing that. So these are the types of challenges that a regional program like this one has in trying to bring ecosystem service values or ecosystem services into the decision-making process. So just to finish up, the program has ecosystem services and other types of assessments as one of its fundamental or core pillars, and using those assessments to support planning processes, planning investment decision making is also a pillar. Third pillar is to try and pilot innovative ideas like the one I mentioned, carbon neutral transport corridor or other low carbon or energy efficiency models. And then the fourth pillar is to try and monitor what's happening to the regions, systems, biocapacity and so on. And so we're really looking forward to this working through a learning network and trying to bring the lessons from other countries and other regions to bear on this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Sanath for the presentation and the case study. I think what's interesting there is Sanath sort of laid out a number of challenges that are being faced at the regional level, and particularly some of the transboundary dimensions of working at that scale. And I think what's interesting there is that there is a framework for cooperation between these countries that are looking at coming together to do sector planning at a regional level across a number of different sectors. That gives an entry point for bringing information about ecosystem service values into decision making. But obviously, as Sanath has laid out, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of establishing those values and putting them at the right scales and linking them with those planning frameworks. So that's something we're very interested to hear from people in the audience a little bit later on about your own perspectives on that, and across various partners here, how we might be able to work together. Now I'd like to move on to the next case study. So I'd like to introduce Anna van Padenburg from WWF. She's the Sustainable Finance Program Leader. Sustainable Finance and Policy Program Leader for the Heart of Borneo program, which covers Indonesia, Malaysia and Brunei, cutting across the whole region. And Anna's, what's interesting, I think, moving from one case study to the next is that perhaps a little bit further along the track, facing some similar issues, but in terms of ecosystem service valuation and addressing the planning options, the HOV programs have been moving ahead very quickly. So, Anna, thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, for the elaborate introduction. Yes, I work for the WWF Global Initiative, supporting the 3 governments in their initiative, the Heart of Borneo initiative. I'll tell you a bit more as I go on these slides. We have just recently done a study called Investing in Nature for a Green Economy, and we focused on valuing several ecosystem services. We did not look at everything in detail. We wanted at the beginning to have a total economic value, but it's absolutely impossible. There are many reasons why. I can talk to you later on in more detail if you wish. But it's a start. It's to kickstart further work and particularly encourage research groups to study more, because while it's increasing significantly, as Joel is saying, I don't think enough. So a lot more needs to be done to build this evidence to policymakers and to practitioners to really make the case happen. We have publications there. I've just got a few, but it's also online, and I'll tell you at the end of the presentation the site that you can go to. Right, first of all, a bit of introduction on where the Heart of Borneo is, what happens there. It's a landscape covering 22 million hectares across 3 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, including Sabah and Sarawak, and Brunei. It's basically what is in the boundary, in the blue boundary there. A lot of people used to think, and I still think today, the Heart of Borneo is all protected areas. And it's absolutely not. Only 16% of this, which is in purple here, is officially protected area. The rest is open for development areas. There are some areas which they call hutan lindung, under protection, but there's still mining going on in these areas and other economic activities. So basically, areas outside officially protected areas, sometimes even areas inside protected areas. But anyway, it's still very much hunted by a lot of people who want to gain business, who want to basically make economic growth, which is fair enough, and I absolutely